Hello everyone, friends. Have you ever heard stories that send chills down your spine? You know, sometimes life twists plots more dramatically than any movie. Today, I have gathered for you 30 cases that sound like complete fabrications, but they really happened. Prepare some tea, make yourselves comfortable. I promise it will be very interesting. And if you enjoy stories in this format, please support this series with a like, and let us know in the comments which city you are listening from. It really helps the growth of our community. Let's get started. Story number 1. The man who sold the symbol of France for scrap. Paris, spring 1925. The City of Light is just beginning to recover from the Great War. Jazz is once again playing on the streets. Artists are debating in cafes on Montmartre. But the country's economy is falling apart. And amidst this splendor, like a rusty nail, stands the Eiffel Tower. Today, it's hard for us to imagine, but back then, almost 100 years ago, the Iron Lady was considered an ugly temporary structure. It was built for the exhibition in 1889, and its time for use had long since expired. The paint was peeling, the metal was rusting, and the maintenance costs were colossal. Parisians wrote angry letters, demanding that this tragic street lamp be demolished. In a luxurious room at the Crillon Hotel sat a man who read the newspaper with these complaints and smiled. His name was Victor Lustig. He was dressed in an impeccable three-piece suit, spoke 5 languages, and possessed a charisma capable of convincing a tiger to become a vegetarian. He was neither an engineer nor a civil servant. He was the greatest con man of his time, and he had just devised the boldest scam in history. Lustig forged official documents from the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. He sent invitations to the 5 largest scrap metal dealers in Paris for a secret, urgent meeting. The meeting took place at the same hotel. Lustig, presenting himself as the deputy director of the ministry, lowered his voice and shared a state secret. The French government, unable to afford the repairs for the Eiffel Tower, made a difficult decision. The tower would be demolished. And he, Victor Lustig, was authorized to conduct a closed tender for the right to dispose of 7,000 tons of prime metal. The dealers listened to him, holding their breath. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. But Lustig was a keen psychologist. He chose not the wealthiest victim, but the one most insecure. André Poisson was a provincial businessman who dreamed of entering the elite of Parisian society. Purchasing the Eiffel Tower would be his ticket to the top. However, Poisson hesitated. The deal seemed too secretive and too quick. André's wife began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why were the meetings held at a hotel and not at the ministry? The scam hung by a thread. And then Lustig made a brilliant move. He scheduled a personal meeting with Poisson and began to complain about life. He hinted that the salary of a civil servant was woefully small, and that living in Paris was so expensive. He effectively asked for a bribe. Poisson immediately felt relieved. If an official asks for a bribe, it means he is a real, honest person, and that would raise suspicion. A corrupt bureaucrat is a clear and expected element of the system. André Poisson not only wrote a check for a gigantic sum of around 70,000 francs for the purchase of a tower in 1900, which today would be equivalent to $1 million, but he also gave Lustig a substantial bribe on top of that. Upon receiving the suitcase filled with money, Lustig immediately boarded a train to Vienna. The next morning, Poisson arrived at the tower with a crew of workers ready to begin the dismantling. One can only imagine the expressions on the faces of the real guards and watchmen when they were presented with fake documents for the demolition of a national treasure. Poisson's shame was so great that he didn't even go to the police. He was afraid of becoming a laughingstock for all of Paris. Thanks to this silence, Lustig not only avoided arrest. A month later, realizing that he was not being sought, he returned to Paris and attempted to sell the tower again to a different dealer. It was only on this second attempt that the vigilant victim contacted the police, forcing Lustig to flee to America. This man sold air disguised as 7,000 tons of iron, relying solely on the greed and vanity of his victims. But while Lustig relied on psychology, the heroes of our next story faced a phenomenon that defied all logic. They found themselves in the midst of a war, where the opponent knew no fear, felt no pain, and, most terrifyingly, was capable of outrunning a car. Story number 2. The Great War with Emus, or How Machine Guns Were Defeated by Feathers. Australia. The western part of the continent, the Champion region, November 1932. The world stands on the brink of great upheavals. But here, in the sun-scorched steppe, unfolds a conflict that will enter textbooks as the most absurd military operation in history. The opponents, the Royal Australian Artillery, armed with the latest Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The enemy, 20,000 emus. Yes, you heard that right. Giant, flightless, seemingly foolish birds that had migrated to this area in search of water and began to destroy wheat crops. Farmers, veterans of the First World War, panicked and turned to the government. Defense Minister George Pearce, wishing to show strength, sent Major Meredith, a sergeant, and 2 machine gunners to the front. The plan was simple: find a flock, open fire, and collect feathers for the hats of cavalrymen. Major Meredith was confident in a swift victory. Emus are stupid, and the machine gun is the pinnacle of progress, he thought. On November 2nd, the first shots rang out, and it turned out to be a nightmare. The emus turned out to be masters of guerrilla warfare. As soon as the shooting began, the birds did not bunch up like sheep. They instantly scattered in a fan, running in different directions at speeds of 50 kilometers per hour. Hitting a running emu with a heavy machine gun proved to be more difficult than shooting down a fighter. Their feathers were so tough and dense that bullets often simply got stuck in the plumage, failing to inflict fatal wounds unless they hit vital organs. Major Meredith wrote in his diary, "These birds have commanders. Every squad is led by a large black bird that stands guard while others eat. At the slightest hint of danger, it gives a signal and they vanish into the dust." The military changed their tactics. They set an ambush at the watering hole. 1,000 emus approached the water. The machine gunners opened fire at point-blank range. The birds fell and then jumped back up and ran away. The machine gun jammed after the first burst. The result of the ambush? 12 birds were killed and hundreds of rounds were expended. In despair, Meredith ordered a machine gun to be mounted on a truck to pursue the enemy. This ended in disaster. The truck bounced over the bumps so violently that the shooter couldn't aim, while the emus easily outran the vehicle off-road. As a result, the truck crashed into a fence and the tank attack faltered. After a week of fighting, Major Meredith had no choice but to admit defeat and retreat. In his report, he bitterly noted, "If only we had a division with the endurance of these birds, it could withstand any army in the world. They meet machine gun fire with the invulnerability of tanks." The outcome of the war? The army expended nearly 10,000 rounds. The estimated kills ranged from dozens to several hundred birds. There were 0 losses among the men. But the dignity of the Australian army was utterly destroyed. The emus remained the masters of the fields. Farmers had to build fences themselves. This technology turned out to be more effective than artillery. This story teaches us that nature cannot be defeated by brute force. Our next story's hero tried to conquer nature with cunning. He decided to steal an entire island, literally digging it up with a shovel to create his own state, where the laws would be dictated by his madness. Story number 3. A republic built on sand and audacity. The Pacific Ocean, south of the islands of Tonga, 1971. American millionaire Michael Oliver, who made his fortune selling real estate and coins, grew weary of taxes and government control. He was a libertarian to the bone and dreamed of a place without a government. Since no free land remained on the world map, he decided to create his own. Oliver found the Minerva Reef, 2 horseshoe-shaped coral formations that were submerged during high tide. No man's land. No state had laid claim to it, as it was merely a dangerous shoal in the middle of the ocean. Oliver hired a barge loaded with sand from Australia. Tons of sand were dumped onto the reefs, raising them above sea level. On this artificial patch of land, he hoisted a flag and proclaimed the establishment of the Minerva Republic. He issued his own currency, the Minerva dollar, printed passports, and sent letters to the leaders of 100 countries requesting recognition. He promised no taxes, full entrepreneurial freedom, and a paradise for investors. The world shrugged it off, but the neighboring kingdom of Tonga took it seriously. King Tonga Taufahau Tupou I was an imposing figure both in stature and in status. Weighing around 200 kilograms, he looked at the map and decided he wouldn't tolerate a base for smugglers right next to him. In June 1972, the king personally led a military expedition. The Tonga fleet, consisting of one royal yacht, a landing craft, and a tugboat, approached Minerva. On board was the king himself, the state orchestra, and a squad of prisoners assigned the role of Marines. The battle for the Republic of Minerva was short. President Oliver and his government wisely absented themselves. Tongan soldiers, formerly from Zeki, landed on the sand, lowered the Minerva flag, and raised the Tonga flag. The orchestra, standing knee-deep in the water, solemnly played the national anthem. The king declared the reefs the territory of the kingdom. Michael Oliver attempted to protest at the United Nations, but no one came to the defense of the sandy castle. A few years later, nature finished the king's work. Storms washed away the sandy shore, and the Republic of Minerva once again disappeared beneath the waves, becoming nothing more than a line in the annals of curiosities. Michael Oliver tried to create a country out of nothing, but the hero of our next story created something out of trash. He built a palace that became a monument to loneliness and unrequited love, using only what others tossed away. Story number 4. The postman who built a castle from dreams and stones. France, the village of Autrif, 1879. Ferdinand Cheval, an ordinary rural postman, is 43 years old. He is silent, reserved, and walks 32 kilometers every day. He delivers letters to the surrounding villages. His life seems gray and bleak, like the dusty road beneath his feet. But one day in April, his foot caught on a strangely shaped stone. Cheval picked it up. The stone reminded him of some fantastic animal. He put it in his pocket. The next day he found another stone, and another. In the mind of this simple postman, who had never ventured beyond his canton and had no architectural education, a mad idea was born. He decided to build the perfect palace, one that would combine all styles and eras of all gods and all beings he had seen on postcards and in magazines delivered to the addressees. Every day for the next 33 years, Ferdinand Cheval set out on his route with a wheelbarrow. While delivering mail, he collected stones. The locals considered him crazy. They saw him, tired after his night shift, mixing cement by the light of an oil lamp, laying his finds. He built alone. His palace grew slowly, like a living organism. It was not a building in the conventional sense. It was a hallucination made of stone. Here were Hindu temples, Egyptian tombs, medieval castles, Swiss chalets, and mosques. The walls were decorated with figures of octopuses, caimans, elephants, and giants. He wove shells and glass into the stone. Cheval completed construction in 1912 when he was 76 years old. The palace measured 26 meters in length and 10 meters in height. He wanted to be buried in his creation, like a pharaoh, but French laws prohibited burials outside of cemeteries. Cheval did not give up. At the age of 78, he went to the local cemetery and began to build again. For another 8 years, he erected a mausoleum of silence and eternal peace in the same fantastic style. He died at 88, just 1 year after finishing the mausoleum. His perfect palace still stands today, recognized as a masterpiece of naive architecture, a monument to the perseverance of one man who proved that a dream can be built with one's own hands, stone by stone. Cheval built to leave a mark, but the hero of our next story became famous for vanishing without leaving any trace, name, or parachute with which he jumped out of the plane carrying a bag of money. Story number 5. A ghost in a business suit and $200,000. Portland, Airport, November 24th, 1971. The eve of Thanksgiving. A man in his 40s, dressed in a dark suit, white shirt, and black tie, with a pearl tie clip, approaches the counter of Northwest Orient Airlines. He purchases a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. He pays in cash. He takes seat 187 aboard a Boeing 727. He orders a bourbon with soda. He is polite, calm, and does not stand out. Shortly after takeoff, he hands a flight attendant a note. The young woman, used to the flirts of passengers, puts it in her pocket without reading it. "Miss, you better take a look at that note," Cooper softly says. "I have a bomb." He opens his briefcase. Inside, the stewardess sees red cylinders, wires, and a large battery. His demands were specific and strangely modest for such a risk. $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes, not 2 but 4. This made the police think he planned to take hostages. The plane circled over Seattle while money and parachutes were gathered on the ground. Cooper was unperturbed. He paid for his drink and even insisted that the flight attendant keep the change. When the plane landed, he released all passengers and 2 flight attendants in exchange for the money and parachutes. The pilots, flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant remained on board. Cooper ordered them to fly to Mexico, but at minimum speed, with landing gear and flaps extended, at an altitude no greater than 3,000 feet, and, crucially, with a depressurized cabin. The Boeing took off into the night. Heavy icy rain poured down. 2 Air Force fighters followed the liner, but in the darkness and clouds they lost visual contact. Somewhere over the wild forests of Washington state at 2013, in the cockpit, a light came on indicating that the rear stairway door was open. The cabin pressure began to drop. When the plane landed in Reno for refueling, the cabin was empty. Dan Cooper had vanished, along with the money and parachutes, leaving only his cheap tie with the clip on the seat. The FBI launched the largest manhunt in its history. They scoured the forests, dragged rivers, and checked thousands of suspects, but found very little. In 1980, a boy found a bundle of decaying $20 bills on the banks of the Columbia River, the serial numbers matching those of the ransom. Did Cooper survive? Jumping at night, in the rain, in the forest, in a business suit and moccasins, with a training parachute that could not be steered, the odds were negligible. Yet, no body was ever found. The case of Cooper, as wrongly dubbed by journalists, remains the only unsolved air hijacking in the history of American aviation. Cooper stepped into the void and became a legend. But the hero of our next story stepped into the void to survive, and lived where it was physically impossible, drifting on the wreckage of a ship among sharks, having only a watch that stopped at the moment of the disaster. Story number 6. The cook who lived at the bottom of the ocean for 3 days. The Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Nigeria, May 2013. The tugboat Jazzcon 4 was performing routine maintenance work on oil platforms. There were 12 people on board. Among them was 29-year-old ship's cook Harrison Okeem. At 4:30 in the morning, while most of the crew was sleeping, a storm hit. A giant wave capsized the vessel. The tug began to sink rapidly. Harrison was in the restroom. This saved him from immediate death in his cabin, but not from terror. The ship turned upside down and sank to a depth of 30 meters. Water rushed in, filling the corridors with a roar. Harrison, in nothing but his underwear, felt his way in the dark, hearing the cries of his crewmates abruptly cut off. He reached the officer's cabin and found an air pocket. Imagine sitting in complete darkness, waist-deep in icy water. You know you are at the bottom of the ocean. There are 30 meters of water above you. The silence around is grave-like, broken only by the creaking of metal and sounds that chill the blood. Harrison heard fish devouring the bodies of his dead friends in nearby compartments. He spent 60 hours like that, nearly 3 days. He had no food. He found 1 bottle of cola floating in the water. The oxygen in his air pocket was slowly running out, poisoning him with carbon dioxide. The cold water drained life from his body. He prayed, quoting Psalms, convinced he would die. On the 3rd day, he heard a tapping. It was divers sent not to rescue, but to recover bodies. They did not expect to find anyone alive. Harrison saw the light of a flashlight in the water. He reached out and touched the diver. The diver recoiled in horror, thinking it was a corpse moving in the current, but the hand gripped his fingers. The diver's voice over the radio, trembling with shock, transmitted to the support vessel. "He's alive." He's alive. The rescue was complicated. Harrison had spent too much time at that depth. If they had brought him up immediately, he would have died from decompression sickness. His blood would have boiled from nitrogen. They placed a helmet on him, transferred him to a diving bell, and then he spent another 2 days in a hyperbaric chamber on the surface undergoing decompression. Harrison Okeem became the only survivor out of 12 crew members. Doctors called his survival in the air pocket at such a depth for such a duration a physiological miracle. He never went to sea again, changing his profession to cook on land. Harrison survived trapped underwater, but the hero of our next story voluntarily trapped himself in ice and snow, embarking on a solo trek to the pole to prove that a person can survive on nothing but chocolate and faith in themselves. Story number 7. The Doctor Who Went to the North Pole Alone. The Arctic, a white desert where the horizon merges with the sky and the compass goes mad. March 6, 1986. French doctor Jean-Louis Etienne stands at the edge of an icy field in northern Canada. Before him lie 1,000 kilometers of drifting ice to the North Pole. No one has ever reached the pole alone without dogs and without external support to drop supplies from a plane. Etienne is 40 years old. He is not a professional polar explorer. He is a doctor specializing in sports medicine and nutrition. His expedition is a scientific experiment on his own body and spirit. He pulls a sled weighing 50 kilograms containing a tent, sleeping bag, stove, and food. His diet is meticulously calculated down to the gram, but it is meager and specific. No meat. The base of his diet? Freeze-dried products, nuts, and chocolate. Plenty of chocolate. The first days became hellish. The sled overturned on the pressure ridges and on piles of ice blocks as tall as a house. Etienne fell, got up, and fell again. The temperature dropped to -52 degrees. At such cold, metal becomes brittle and plastic crumbles. Sweat on his clothes froze, turning into an icy armor. But the main enemy was not the cold, but the drift. The ice in the Arctic does not remain still. It is a massive conveyor driven by currents. Etienne walked northward, but the ice beneath his feet drifted south. There were days when he covered 20 kilometers, exhausting himself. Yet in the morning, after checking his coordinates with a sextant, he would find himself further from the pole than he was the day before. It was a Sisyphean task in an icy hell. He talked to himself, he sang songs, he gave a name to his sled. Loneliness pressed on his psyche more than the frost. In the white haze, hallucinations began. He believed he saw cities on the horizon, or heard the voices of friends. Once he fell into a lead. This is the worst nightmare of a polar explorer. Water instantly freezes movement. Etienne managed to escape, but he had to set up the tent immediately and dry his clothes, burning precious fuel, knowing that if he did not warm up within half an hour, he would be dead. He walked for 63 days. On May 11, 1986, Jean-Louis Etienne reached the North Pole. He became the first person in history to make this journey alone on skis. He lost 10 kilograms, his face was blackened from frostbite and the sun, but he prevailed. Etienne proved that the limits of human endurance are much further than we think. But the heroes of our next story push the boundaries not of endurance, but of luck. They survived a plane crash in the Andes, and to return home, they had to break humanity's most terrible taboo. Story number 8. Those who return from the icy mountain. The Andes, October 13, 1972. A Uruguayan Air Force plane, carrying a rugby team called the Old Christians and their relatives, was flying to Chile. Young, strong, full-of-life guys joked and tossed a ball in the aisle. In the clouds, the pilot made a fatal navigation error and began to descend too early. The plane crashed into an unnamed peak deep in the Andes at an altitude of 4,000 meters. The impact severed the wings and tail. The fuselage, like a giant sled, slid down the slope and buried itself in the snow. Of the 45 people on board, 12 died instantly. 5 more died by morning from injuries and the cold. The survivors found themselves in a white hell. They had no warm clothing, only summer jackets and shirts. They had no food, only a little chocolate, wine, and crackers they found in their luggage. All around them were only snow and rocks. The temperature at night dropped to -30. They waited for rescuers. On the 10th day, they found a small transistor radio receiver and were able to catch a radio signal. The news anchor reported that the search for the missing airplane had been halted. They were presumed dead. This was the moment of truth. The world had turned its back on them. Now they were alone. Hunger became unbearable. Their bodies began to consume themselves. The guys, used to athletic burdens, were visibly weakening. There were no animals or plants around, just snow and the aluminum of the fuselage, and the bodies of their deceased friends lying in the snow. They made a decision that is impossible to judge and unimaginable while sitting in a warm chair. They entered into an agreement. If one of them died, the others could use his body to survive. It was a communion of flesh for the sake of life. They survived for 72 days. An avalanche covered them, burying the fuselage and killing 8 more. They slept pressed against each other to avoid freezing. Eventually, the 2 strongest, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, decided to go for help. Without gear, without maps, exhausted, they undertook an incredible journey through high mountains. They walked for 10 days. When they spotted a Chilean shepherd on the other side of a raging river, Parado threw him a stone with a note wrapped around it. It said, "I am from the plane that crashed in the mountains." On December 23rd, 14 skeletons clad in skin were rescued. Their story shocked the world. At first they were condemned, labeled as cannibals, but when people learned the truth of what they had to endure, condemnation turned to awe at the strength of the human spirit. They survived thanks to their love of life and of each other. These people returned from the brink of death. But the hero of our next story, on the contrary, ventured into the realm of death, or at least to its threshold, to save thousands. He descended into the crater of an active volcano to take gas samples, knowing he could be burned alive at any moment. This is story number 2. The poet of fire who ventured into the throat of the devil. Belgian volcanologist Haroun Taziev was a man in love with the earth, but not with the kind of earth covered in green meadows and calm rivers, rather with the kind that bubbles, erupts, and spews flames. He saw volcanoes as living beings and dedicated his life to understanding their language. 1948. The Katura volcano in Congo. This was the first serious eruption that Taziev witnessed. The locals fled in panic, while he walked toward the flow of lava. He got so close that the heat singed his eyebrows. He stood there, enchanted by the power of the elements, and realized that observing from a distance was not enough. He needed to look inside. His most audacious feat occurred on the Nyiragongo volcano in Africa. In the crater of this volcano, a constant lake of boiling lava swirls, a rare and deadly phenomenon. It's a gigantic cauldron of molten rock with temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Taziev decided to descend to the first terrace inside the crater to take gas samples. No one had done this before him. He donned an asbestos suit, resembling a spacesuit, and began his descent on a rope. The walls of the crater reverberated with a booming sound around him. Poisonous gases, sulfur, chlorine, carbon dioxide swirled as a dense fog. One breath without a gas mask and his lungs would be burned. He descended to a depth of almost 200 meters. He found himself in a world where human laws did not apply. Below him, just a few dozen meters under his feet, molten lava bubbled. It spat fountains of liquid rock. The heat was so intense that even through his protective suit, his skin burned. Taziev didn't just take samples, he began filming. He had a movie camera with him. He captured the dance of fire from a distance, unseen by any human. He stood at the edge of a ledge while bombs and chunks of solidifying lava fell around him. At one moment, the wind changed. A cloud of scorching gas enveloped him. Visibility disappeared. Breathing became difficult even with the mask on. Taziev realized that the trap was closing in. He yanked on the safety rope. The signal to pull him up was sent. He was rescued, half alive, dehydrated, with light burns on his lungs, but happy. His footage and data revolutionized volcanology. Goran Taziev proved that volcanoes could be predicted, if not approached closely without fear. He saved thousands of lives by developing early warning systems based on those very gas samples he collected at great risk. Taziev played with fire and won. But the heroes of our next story faced water, a very large amount of water. They attempted to cross the Pacific Ocean on a raft made of balsa logs to prove a theory that all the world's historians laughed at. Story number 10. 6 brave souls on a raft from the past. The Pacific Ocean, April 28, 1947. In the port of Callao in Peru, a strange vessel was launched into the water. It was neither a ship, nor a yacht, nor even a boat. It was a raft made from 9 huge balsa logs, bound together with ropes made from hemp. Not a single nail or piece of metal. A face of the sun god Kon-Tiki was painted on the sail. On board was Norwegian anthropologist Thor Heyerdahl and 5 of his companions. Heyerdahl couldn't swim. He was afraid of water, but his faith in his theory was stronger than his fear. Thor argued that Polynesia was settled not from Asia, as all scholars believed, but from South America. The natives could have crossed the ocean on rafts, he said. The professors laughed. The balsa logs will soak and sink in 2 weeks. You are fools. Heyerdahl decided to prove it through action. They set out into the open ocean, surrendering their fate to the current of Humboldt and the trade winds. The first weeks were a trial. The raft creaked and moaned on the waves. The ropes dug into the wood. The crew anxiously monitored the sinking of the logs, but the scientists were mistaken. The resin-soaked balsa did not sink. The ropes did not wear down the wood. Instead, they bit into the soft timber, making the structure even sturdier. The ocean became their home. Flying fish jumped onto the deck in the mornings, providing breakfast. They caught tuna and dorado. Beneath the raft, whale sharks, giants the size of a bus, peacefully swam alongside, mistaking the raft for a sea monster. They survived storms when the waves were higher than the mast. They were repairing the raft, risking being swept overboard. They sent radio messages, and the world, holding its breath, watched the dot on the map. On the 101st day of their voyage, they saw land. It was the atoll of Roroya in the Tuamotu archipelago. But seeing land was one thing, and landing was another. The raft was headed straight for the sharp coral reefs. This was the most dangerous moment of the expedition. Giant waves of the surf hurled the multi-ton raft against the rocks. Heyerdahl ordered everyone to hold on to anything they could. A crash. The sound of breaking wood. The water enveloped them. When the foam settled, they found themselves in a lagoon. The raft was shattered, but all 6 of them were alive. They had crossed 8,000 kilometers of open ocean using Stone Age technology. The Kon-Tiki expedition became a triumph of the human spirit. Heyerdahl proved that the ocean is not a barrier, but a road for ancient civilizations. His book became a bestseller, and the documentary won an Oscar. Heyerdahl crossed the ocean on logs, but the hero of our next story crossed the ocean in an even stranger vessel. In a bathtub. Yes, in an ordinary cast-iron bathtub with a hanging motor. Seeking a place in the Guinness Book of Records, he instead encountered the storm of the century. Story number 11. The man who took a bath in the middle of the Atlantic. We tend to think of sailors as tough men on sturdy ships, but history has examples where bravery tips into absurdity. Meet Major Phil Morrison, a retired British paratrooper. In 1968, he decided that swimming or sailing across the English Channel was too mundane. He walked into a plumbing store, bought an ordinary cast-iron bathtub, attached a motor to it, named it Matilda, and crossed the channel. But that was just the beginning. In the early 80s, as the world went mad for records, there was a man who decided to outdo them all. His name was Tom McLean. He was a former SAS soldier, a man of steel, who single-handedly rowed across the Atlantic in a rowing boat. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted to do something that would make the world laugh and marvel at the same time. Tom decided to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a bottle. He built a vessel that looked like a giant beer bottle from Tiffin Ale. It measured 11 meters in length. Inside it was cramped, hot, and even on calm water it made him nauseous. The shape of the bottle rendered the vessel extremely unstable. In sideways waves, it rolled over like a log. In 1990, Tom McLean set off from New York. His destination was Falmouth in England. The journey was torturous. The bottle did not slice through the waves, it crashed into them. Tom was constantly soaked in wet clothes. The noise inside the hull was amplified by the vessel's shape. He had to tie himself to his bunk to avoid being thrown around the cabin. During a storm one night, a hurricane hit him. The bottle turned upside down. Tom found himself inside a giant rattle, flying upside down in the black abyss of the ocean. But thanks to its low center of gravity, the heavy keel righted the vessel like a weeble. Tom lost communication. He ran out of fresh produce. He lived on canned food and drank desalinated water. He talked to seagulls. After 37 days of solitude and a motion sickness that would make an astronaut dizzy, a yellow bottle sailed into the harbor of Falmouth. Tom McLean stepped onto the shore, swaying but smiling. He became the only person in history to cross an ocean in a vessel intended for a giant's tea party. This man turned absurdity into a feat, but the hero of our next story accomplished an act that was long considered a crime. He saved 669 children from Nazi death camps by organizing trains of life and kept quiet about it for 50 years. This is the story of number 12, the stockbroker who outsmarted the Gestapo, London. December 1938. Nicholas Winton, a 29-year-old stockbroker, was about to go skiing in Switzerland. He had already packed his bags when a friend from Prague called him. "Cancel the skiing, come here, I need your help." The situation was critical. Winton arrived in Prague and was met with horror. The Sudetenland had already been annexed by Nazi Germany. Thousands of refugees, mostly Jews, were living in camps under inhumane conditions, awaiting Hitler's inevitable invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia. The world was turning a blind eye, but Winton could not. He realized that saving the adults was impossible, as countries refused to accept refugees. However, Britain agreed to take in children up to 17 years old, provided that a bond of £50 was paid for each child and a foster family was found. Winton turned his hotel room at the Europa into headquarters. By day, he worked on the stock exchange, and by night, he wrote hundreds of letters pleading with unknown British citizens to take in Czech children. He forged visas, bribed officials, and arranged with conductors. The Gestapo was watching him. He risked his life every day while in Prague. The first train with children departed on the 14th of March, 1939, just one day before German tanks rolled into Prague. Over the next 5 months, Winton organized 7 more trains. It was a race against time and death. Parents shoved their crying children through the windows of the carriages, realizing they were seeing them for the last time. Little ones wore tags with numbers around their necks. The largest train was supposed to leave on the 1st of September 1939, carrying 250 children. But that morning, the Second World War began. Borders closed, and the train did not leave. Almost all of those children perished in concentration camps. This became Winton's greatest sorrow for the rest of his life. But 669 children were saved. They grew up in Britain, becoming doctors, scientists, politicians, and directors. Among them was Karl Reiss, the director of the French Lieutenant's Woman. The most astonishing aspect of this story is the silence. After the war, Nicholas Winton never spoke of his deeds. Even his wife Greta was unaware. The secret was uncovered only in 1988. 50 years later, Greta found an old album in the attic filled with photos of the children, lists of names, and letters. She asked her husband what it was. Nicholas simply shrugged, saying, "This is what I did before the war." Greta passed the album to journalists. Winton was invited to the BBC talk show, That's Life. He sat in the front row, thinking he was just an audience member. The host opened the album and began reading. "There is someone in this audience whose name is on this list. Vera Gissing. Please stand up." The woman sitting next to Nicholas Winton stood up and hugged him. Then the host asked, "Is there anyone in this room who owes their life to Nicholas Winton?" And at that moment, the entire audience stood up. Dozens of people, many of them with tears in their eyes. These were the very children. Winton's children. Nicholas Winton, the man who saved the generation, quietly cried as he wiped his eyes with his fingers. He lived to be 106 years old, leaving behind not only memories, but also 6,000 descendants of those he saved. Winton rescued children from war, but the hero of our next story escaped from war himself, living in a cathedral belfry for 100 days, feeding on pigeons and rainwater while battles raged below for his city. This is story number 13, The Man Who Lived Above the War. Italy, the town of Cassino, 1944. Below, one of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War was raging. The Allies were storming the Gustav Line. The Germans defended themselves with fanatical determination. The town was turned to ruins. All that remained of the famous Monte Cassino monastery were dust and stones. But amid this hell, there was a spot that death had not reached: the partially destroyed bell tower of St. John's Church. There, on a tiny platform under the bell, a man was hiding. His name is Antonio. Antonio is not a soldier. He is the local fool, the town madman, whom everyone pitied and fed before the war. When the bombing started, all the residents fled or were killed. In a panic, Antonio climbed to the highest place he knew, the belfry. An explosion collapsed the staircase leading down. Antonio found himself trapped at a height of 30 meters. Below, on the streets, tanks were rolling, explosions roared. Soldiers were killing each other in hand-to-hand combat. And up there, in his stone nest, Antonio lived his strange life. He became the ghost of Cassino. Snipers on both sides saw movement in the tower but did not shoot. At first they thought he was an observer, but Antonio was behaving too strangely. He waved his arms at the birds, danced to the sound of the artillery, and curled up asleep at the edge of the abyss. Soldiers, weary from the war, began to see him as a kind of talisman, the spirit of this dead town. The problem was food. Antonio had no supplies, but he had neighbors, the pigeons that were also hiding in the belfry. Antonio caught them with his bare hands. He drank rainwater that pooled in the hollows of the old stones. He lived there for 105 days. When the Allies finally took the city, and Polish soldiers raised a flag over the ruins of the monastery, they heard a faint cry from above. Engineers set up a rope ladder and rescued Antonio. He was emaciated, dirty, and had grown a beard, but he was alive, and he smiled. In his pockets they found a collection of shell fragments that he had collected like jewels. For him, the war was just a very loud storm that needed to be weathered. Antonio, the man the world considered mad, turned out to be the most sensible of them all. He found the only way to survive where tens of thousands of ordinary people perished. Antonio survived thanks to height, but the heroes of our next story survived thanks to depth and darkness. They were miners, trapped underground for 2 weeks and eating coal dust to deceive their hunger, while rescuers drilled through the rock at random. Story number 14. A Miracle in Lengedi, or a Call from the Other World. Germany, October 24th, 1963. An iron ore mine in Lende. It was a typical evening shift. 129 miners were underground, extracting ore for the German economic miracle. At 8 o'clock, what every miner fears happened. The water retention pond burst. 500,000 cubic meters of icy sludge mixed with mud and stones surged into the mine shafts. The flow was so powerful that it ripped steel beams apart and flattened carts. 79 people managed to reach the surface in the first hours. The rest were trapped. The rescue operation began immediately, but hope dwindled with each passing hour. A week later, on November 1st, the mine management announced a mourning ceremony. It was officially declared that there were no survivors underground. The ventilation had stopped working, and water had flooded all known cavities. But in reality, in the dead zone, in a small air pocket at a depth of 60 meters, 21 people were sitting. They were in complete darkness. The water was rising to their throats, and the air was becoming scarcer. They had no food. They chewed on leather straps and licked the condensation off the walls. To avoid going insane, they sang hymns and took turns telling stories about what they would eat for dinner when they got out. On November 3rd, 10 days after the accident, 3 miners decided to take a desperate step. They plunged into the icy water, trying to swim through the flooded tunnel to the exit. They did not return. 11 remained. On the surface, against all logic and orders to cease operations, a group of engineers decided to drill one last exploratory borehole in an area they named Old Man, an abandoned site. The chance of finding someone there was 1 in a million. The drill went through the rock and fell into the void. The engineers lowered a microphone, and suddenly a knock came through the speakers, crackling with static. Knock, knock, knock. Then a weak voice. There are 11 of us. We are alive. Help us. Germany froze in shock. This was called the miracle in Lengeda. Chancellor Ludwig Erhard interrupted the government's work. The whole country was glued to their televisions. The rescue operation was incredibly complicated. The borehole was too narrow for a person. It had to be widened without collapsing the ceiling of the cave where the people were sitting. They lowered food, warm clothing, and letters from loved ones through a narrow pipe. On November 7th, 2 weeks after the disaster, the first survivor was brought to the surface. Last to emerge, the 11th, was a 50-year-old electrician. When he saw the sky, he fell to his knees and wept. These people returned from the grave that bureaucracy had already dug for them. But the story that we will open next tells of a man who buried himself alive in a bottle of vodka and woke up in a morgue to throw the most joyful party of his life. Story number 15. The corpse who froze to death to stay warm. Poland, the city of Kamienna Góra, winter 1995. The frost was so severe that birds were freezing mid-flight. A local resident, 56-year-old Mr. Tadeusz, known in the city for his love of strong drinks, was returning home from a party. The way was not short, and inside Mr. Tadeusz sloshed enough warmth to consider a snowdrift a cozy bed. He decides to sit down and rest on a bench in the park and falls asleep. In the morning, passers-by find him. Tadeusz is not breathing, there is no pulse. His body is cold and hard as stone. The paramedics declare death from hypothermia. The body is taken to the morgue. The pathologist, exhausted after the shift, fills out the paperwork, attaches a tag to Mr. Tadeusz's finger, and places him in the refrigeration unit, postponing the autopsy until tomorrow. Several hours pass. The morgue is silent, and suddenly the guard, making his rounds, hears strange noises coming from the refrigerator. A knock, followed by muffled screams and, most incredibly, singing. Someone inside is singing Polish folk songs. The guard is not easily intimidated, but he is superstitious. He crosses himself and, with trembling hands, opens the heavy door of the unit. Out comes Tadeusz, wrapped in a sheet, blue from the cold, shaking but alive. "Where the hell am I?" he asks, chattering his teeth. "And why is it so cold in here? Give me a blanket." It turned out that the alcohol in Tadeusz's blood acted as antifreeze. He had slipped into a state of deep hibernation. His heartbeat slowed to just a few beats per minute. His breathing became shallow. The doctors took this for death. But in the relative warmth of the morgue compared to the street, and inside the refrigerator where it was warmer than in the snowdrifts, his body began to thaw. The funniest part of the story is what Mr. Tadeusz did after his resurrection. He refused hospitalization. He got dressed, gathered his belongings, including the half-finished bottle found in his pocket, and went back to the same party he had left the night before. His friends, who had already begun to mourn him, nearly collapsed from a heart attack upon seeing Tadeusz at the door. Tadeusz sat down at the table, poured himself a shot, and said, "Well, to health. I was there. It's cold and boring. Better here. Mr." Tadeusz cheated death thanks to vodka, but the hero of our next story survived thanks to a watch. He was the only person who was late for the 2 deadliest flights in history, simply because he loved to take his time packing his suitcase. Story number 16. The man who missed his date with death. Imagine a man who wakes up feeling a heavy sense of frustration. He looks at the alarm clock, which didn't ring, at the open suitcase, and realizes he is out of time. The taxi is stuck in traffic, check-in is closed, and the flight he was supposed to take is already climbing in the sky, leaving him in the stuffy airport terminal. At this moment, he curses his slow nature and fate. He does not yet know that in an hour he will be kneeling in gratitude to the heavens for every lost minute. Martin de Jong is a professional cyclist from the Netherlands. His life consists of constant flights, competitions, and a strict schedule. But in 2014, his personal guardian angel seemed to be working overtime, performing the impossible, twice in 4 months. On July 17, 2014, Martin was supposed to fly from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. This was flight MH19 of Malaysian Airlines. The athlete was almost ready to buy the ticket, but at the last moment, literally just a few hours before departure, he came across another offer. Another flight with a layover was €300 cheaper. Being a frugal Dutchman, Martin decided, why pay more? I will take a different route. He returned his ticket for flight CHY17. A few hours after takeoff, that airplane was shot down over Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. Martin watched the news at the airport, clutching his cheap ticket, unable to say a word. Any other person after such an incident would never board a plane again. But Martin was an athlete, and contracts required his presence on the other side of the world. March 8, 2014. Yes, we rewind time to understand the scale of this mystery. Flight MX370, the very same missing Boeing that became the greatest enigma of the century. Martin de Jong was supposed to be on that flight. He was at the check-in counter in Kuala Lumpur, but there was a technical hiccup with his luggage or documents. He hesitated for just 10 minutes. The doors closed right in front of him. The airplane took off without him. An hour later, MX-0 disappeared from the radars forever, dissolving in the endless waters of the Indian Ocean. 239 people vanished without a trace. Martin de Jong bought tickets for ghost flights twice in 1 year. Twice he was meant to turn to ash or vanish into nothingness. He was saved by €300 and a 10-minute delay. When journalists surrounded him, trying to understand the secret of his luck, he softly replied, "I'm just a very lucky guy who doesn't like to rush." This man cheated aviation statistics and death itself simply by slowing his pace. But the heroine of our next story survived not by being slow, but by becoming invisible. She spent several years in a secret room, no bigger than a doghouse, hiding from an entire army. Her only amusement was a crack in the wall, through which she saw the legs of her enemies. Story number 17. A prisoner in her own home who became invisible. Poland, the city of Przemysl, 1942. The Holocaust rages across Europe. Jewish families are disappearing into ghettos and camps. 13-year-old Stefania Pojorska, a Catholic, is left alone with her 6-year-old sister Hiliana after the death of their father and the kidnapping of their mother and brother for forced labor in Germany. Stefania lives in a large house, but this house is not a fortress, it is a trap. In the attic, she hides 13 Jews. They are friends of her family, neighbors, children. If the Germans find them, they will shoot everyone on the spot, including Stefania and Hiliana. The situation becomes critical when the German command decides to requisition Stefania's house for the needs of the army. Wehrmacht officers and 2 nurses move into the rooms on the first floor. Imagine this horror. On the first floor live Nazis who eat, laugh, and clean their weapons, while directly above their heads, in complete silence, sit 13 doomed people. Stefania is a teenager with the weight of 15 lives on her shoulders. She must feed them, carry out waste, and ensure that not a single floorboard creaks. She works in a factory to earn money for food, buying groceries on the black market in different parts of the city to avoid suspicion by not purchasing large amounts of bread. The most terrifying moment came when the German officer decided to inspect the attic. Stefania stood below. Her heart pounded so loudly that it seemed to drown out the soldier's footsteps. The Jews in the attic froze. One of them, Joseph, held a vial of poison in his hands, ready to take his own life and that of his family to avoid falling into the hands of the Gestapo alive. The officer climbed a few steps, but the attic was cluttered with old junk, and it was dark. "Only rats here," he grumbled and went back down. Stefania and 13 ghosts lived like this from 2002 to 1912. They survived the winter without heating, illness without doctors, and the constant maddening fear of being discovered by the sound of breathing. On the 27th of July, 1944, Soviet troops entered Przemysl. 13 people descended from the attic. They were exhausted, pale, but alive. Stefania Podgorska, the girl who became a mother to grown men and women, later married one of those she saved, Joseph Berzaminski. She proved that courage does not depend on age or weapons. Sometimes, courage is simply the ability to remain silent and carry bread right under the enemy's nose. Stefania hid people in the attic. But the hero of our next story hid in an even stranger place. He lived for 18 years in the terminal of Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, becoming a man without a homeland, without documents, but with his red sofa and worldwide fame. Story number 18. A citizen of nowhere, the king of Terminal 1. Paris, Charles de Gaulle Airport. August 1988. Mehran Karimi Nasseri, an Iranian refugee, was expelled from his country for protesting against the Shah, arrived in France. His destination was the United Kingdom, where he hoped to find his mother. But along the way, his bag with his documents was stolen. Without a passport, he could not enter London. The British authorities placed him on a return flight to Paris, but he could not enter France without documents either. Mehran found himself in a legal black hole. He was in the transit zone of Terminal 1. This is neutral territory. Formally, you are no longer on the plane, but you are not yet in France. The police could not arrest him since he entered legally, but they could not let him out into the city either. They told him, "Wait until we sort this out." He sat on a red plastic bench near the pizzeria and stayed there for 18 years. Mehran, nicknamed Sir Alfred by the staff, turned a few square meters of the terminal into his home. He slept on the bench, washed in the public restroom before the first passengers arrived, always perfectly clean and shaven, and ate using food vouchers provided by airport personnel. His days went by the same way. He read newspapers, wrote a diary consisting of thousands of pages, and observed the flow of people. Millions of passengers passed by him. Styles changed, presidents came and went, currencies evolved, the franc was replaced by the euro, while Sir Alfred remained a constant presence in the terminal. He became a local attraction. Airport doctors monitored his health, cleaners left his boxes alone, lawyers fought for his status for years. The most astonishing thing happened in 1999. Belgium and France finally agreed to grant him refugee documents. The lawyer rushed to him with joyful news. "Alfred, you are free. You can go out." But Macron refused to sign the paper. Years of isolation had changed his psyche. The terminal had become his world, his safe shell. The outside world frightened him. He claimed that he was not Iranian Mehran from Syria, but a British subject named Sir Alfred, and demanded documents for this fictional name. He lived in the airport until 2006, when he was hospitalized due to illness. Only then, on a stretcher from the ambulance, did he leave the terminal building for the first time in 18 years. Steven Spielberg purchased the rights to his story for $250,000 and made the film The Terminal with Tom Hanks. But in the film, the hero finds love and an exit. In reality, the Iranian, after receiving the money, could not adapt to life. He lived in shelters, and in 2021, he returned to that very airport, Charles de Gaulle, and died there on that same bench, which was his only home. A man who became a prisoner of freedom of movement. But the hero of our next story became a prisoner of speed. He survived a crash in a race car that disintegrated at a speed of 300 kilometers per hour, and the first thing he asked when he woke up was whether he had won the race. Story number 19. The driver who was cut in half yet continued to drive. Donington Park, United Kingdom, April 1990. The Formula 3 qualifying session is in progress. Young British driver Martin Donnelly is behind the wheel of his yellow Lotus car. He is talented, ambitious, and dreams of Formula 1. At one of the fastest corners of the circuit, the suspension of his car breaks. The vehicle, hurtling at a speed of 270 kilometers per hour, becomes an uncontrollable projectile. It crashes into a concrete barrier at a right angle. The impact was so powerful that the carbon fiber monocoque, The safety capsule meant to protect the driver tore apart like a paper bag. The car literally disintegrated. The engine flew one way, the wheels the other, and Martin Donnelly was thrown on the asphalt. The scene that the marshals and doctors saw was horrific. The driver lay in the middle of the track, strapped to a piece of the seat. His body was contorted in an unnatural pose, resembling a rag doll. One leg was twisted back. The helmet was cracked. He was not breathing. His face began to turn blue. Professor Sid Watkins, the chief medical officer of Formula One, arrived at the scene within 30 seconds. He saw that Donnelly was dying. He began resuscitation right there on the asphalt, in a pool of fuel and blood. Sid manually opened the driver's airways and forced his heart to beat once more. Martin had multiple fractures of the skull, legs, pelvis, a collapsed lung, and internal bleeding. The doctors at the hospital gave him zero chance of survival. They didn't even operate on his legs right away, believing he would die from his brain injuries. But Martin Donnelly refused to die. He spent 7 weeks in a coma. His body was put back together like a puzzle. The doctors used titanium plates, pins, and screws. After 3 months, he woke up. The first thing he asked upon seeing Sid Watkins was, "When can I get back behind the wheel?" The doctors told him that he would never walk again. Martin learned to walk, albeit with a strong limp. They said he would never get behind the wheel of a race car. 3 years later, Martin Donnelly returned to the track. Of course, his Formula One career ended before it even began, but he became a successful team manager and mentor for young drivers. A photograph of his body lying on the track is still considered one of the most shocking images in motorsport history. Yet, Martin looks at it with a smile. "It was a bad day at the office, but I'm still here." Donnelly survived a crash against concrete. But the hero of our next story survived a plunge into the water from a height of 75 meters. He jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, not for fame, but to die. But the water refused to take him. Story number 20. A second of regret lasting 70 meters. San Francisco, Golden Gate Bridge, September 25th, 2000. Kevin Hentz was 19 years old. He suffered from severe depression and bipolar disorder. The voices in his head convinced him that he was unwanted, that he was a burden, and that the only way out was to step down. He took a bus, crying the entire way, hoping that someone would ask him, "Buddy, are you okay?" If just one person had noticed him, he wouldn't have done it. But people looked away. On the bridge, a tourist asked him to take her picture, but she didn't see the tears on his face. Kevin approached the railing, 75 meters to the water. The falling speed was 120 kilometers per hour. Hitting the water from that height felt like hitting a concrete wall. The survival rate was less than 1%. He climbed over the railing and pushed off. And in that very millisecond as his hands left the metal, he realized one thought. A thought that visits almost all survivors of suicide attempts. I want to live. All the problems that seemed unsolvable a second ago suddenly became minor and fixable. Everything except one. He was already falling down. In 4 seconds of free fall, Kevin managed to brace himself. He realized that if he fell flat, he would be torn apart. He straightened his legs, trying to enter the water like a soldier. The impact was monstrous. He broke 2 vertebrae, but they did not sever his spinal cord. The fragments stopped mere millimeters from the nerves. His lungs were crushed. He couldn't breathe. Kevin sank deep underwater. The instinct to live that awakened during the fall propelled him towards the surface. Despite the hellish pain in his back, he broke through, gasping for air. But then a new threat emerged. The current under the Golden Gate Bridge is very strong, and the water is icy. Kevin started drowning. And then something happened that skeptics would call coincidence, while believers would call it a miracle. Kevin felt something big and slippery pushing him from below. He thought, "A shark! I survived the fall only to be eaten by a shark." But it wasn't a shark. It was a sea lion. The animal swam in circles beneath him, pushing him to the surface, preventing his head from going underwater, until a Coast Guard boat arrived. Kevin Hines became one of 36 people who survived jumping from this bridge, out of thousands who perished. Today, he is a well-known speaker and advocate for suicide prevention. He tells his story to convey a simple message. The moment you let go of the handrails is the moment you realize you've made a mistake. Don't test this for yourself. Kevin survived thanks to a sea lion, but the heroes of our next story survived thanks to beer. Yes, literally. During the earthquake, they found themselves under the rubble of a bar and drank whatever they could find to avoid dying of thirst. This is story number 21, The Bar Counter That Became an Ark. Mexico City, September 19th, 1985. Morning. The city wakes up. People rush to work. At 7:19, the ground shakes. An earthquake measuring 8.1 turns the center of the capital into dust. High-rise buildings collapse like accordions. Hospitals, hotels, residential buildings. Everything crumbles in seconds. In one of the destroyed buildings, 3 survivors find themselves trapped under tons of concrete in an air pocket. They were either staff of a small bar or perhaps night owls who stayed out until morning. History has preserved their names, but the circumstances are what truly matter. They were trapped in complete darkness. There was little air, but enough to breathe. The main problem became thirst. Mexico City is a hot place, and in the confined space under the rubble, the temperature quickly rose. There was no water as the pipes had burst. But luck or irony had it that they were trapped precisely in the storage room of the bar. Miraculously, around them stood boxes of beer and wine that had survived. Under normal circumstances, alcohol dehydrates the body. Doctors would say that drinking alcohol in such a situation is suicidal. But these people had no choice. It was either drink this or die of dehydration. They spent 3 days under the rubble, a total of 9 days. For 9 days, they survived solely on the liquid from the bottles. They drank beer to at least get some calories and moisture. They joked that this was the longest party of their lives, although in reality, they were on the brink of madness from fear, pain, and intoxication in the dark. When rescuers, already losing hope of finding anyone alive, heard knocking and reached them, they caught a strong smell of alcohol. The 3 survivors were exhausted and dehydrated. Alcohol may not be a good substitute for water, but they were alive. Their rescue became a symbol of the resilience of the Mexican people. Newspapers wrote, "Mexico cannot be destroyed as long as there is tequila and hope." Doctors later acknowledged that perhaps the sugars and calories in the drinks, along with the sedative effect of alcohol, which helped them panic less and conserve oxygen, played a role in their survival. These people drank for life in the dark. But the hero of our next story drank only seawater and turtle blood. He spent not 9 days in the ocean, not even 100, but 438 days. This is the story of José Salvador Alvarenga, a man who unwillingly crossed the Pacific Ocean. Story number 22, The Man Who Became Part of the Ocean. Mexico. The shores of Chiapas, November 17th, 2012. 36-year-old fisherman José Salvador Alvarenga and his 22-year-old partner Eskiel Cordoba set out to sea on a 7-meter fiberglass boat. They planned to fish for 30 hours and return with a bountiful catch. Suddenly, a storm hit, which meteorologists named El Norte. The engine stalled, the radio failed, and the boat was carried away into the open ocean like a twig. For 5 days, they battled the elements, scooping out water by hand. When the storm subsided, they found themselves hundreds of kilometers from shore. They drifted. Their diet became that of a prehistoric person. They caught fish with their bare hands as it sought shelter beneath the boat from the sun. They caught seabirds that landed to rest on the deck, and turtles. The biggest problem was fresh water. When it rained, they collected it in the shells of turtles. When there were no rains, Alvarenga drank turtle blood and his own urine. His young companion could not withstand it. Ezeal refused to eat raw fish and birds. His body grew weaker, he fell into depression, and after 4 months, he died of hunger. Before his death, he made Alvarenga promise not to eat his body and to find his mother to tell her what had happened. Alvarenga spoke to his friend's body for 6 days, unable to believe in his death, until he finally buried him in the ocean. He was left all alone. Loneliness was worse than hunger. Alvarenga created imaginary friends, sang songs, and told jokes to himself. He watched the stars, whales, and sharks that rubbed against his boat. He became a part of that world, a man of plankton. He drifted for 438 days. On January 30th, 2014, he saw a green strip on the horizon. It was Ibn Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands. His boat washed ashore. Alvarenga stepped onto land, his hair long and his beard wild like a savage. He had traveled 10,500 kilometers. The locals initially did not believe him, but checks of currents and timings confirmed his story. Alvarenga set an absolute record for survival during a solo drift in modern history. He not only survived, he adapted. Alvarenga became a part of nature. But the hero of our next story, in contrast, subjugated nature to his will. He grew a forest in the desert over 40 years, using only buckets of water and incredible determination. Story number 23. The Man Who Planted a Forest in the Desert. India, Assam, 1979. A 16-year-old boy named Jadav Payeng stands in the middle of a sandy wasteland by the Brahmaputra River. After a severe flood, the water receded, leaving behind dead land strewn with the bodies of snakes that had dried in the sun. This scene struck Jadav to the core. He asked the village elders, "What should I do?" They gave him a few bamboo seedlings and said, "Plant them, maybe something will grow." Jadav did something more. He resolved to bring life back to this land. Every day for the next 40 years, Jadav Payeng planted trees alone. At first he planted bamboo, then succeeded with larger trees. He had no machinery. He carried water from the river in clay pots. He brought red ants from his village to enrich the soil. He fertilized the land with buffalo manure. At first, they laughed at him. They called him the forest madman in the village. But Jadav paid no attention. He just kept planting. The trees grew. Grass appeared, followed by insects, then birds. Soon deer, rabbits, and wild boars came as well. In 30 years, a once barren sandy spit has transformed into a real forest, covering an area of 550 hectares. That's larger than Central Park in New York City. Tigers have returned to this forest, along with rhinoceroses. A herd of 100 elephants started to come here for several months each year. The world was unaware of this subspecies until 2008, when a nature photographer stumbled upon the forest by chance. He couldn't believe his eyes. On the map, this area was marked as a desert. Local residents pointed him to a man in simple clothing who lived in a hut on the edge of the forest. That man was Jadav Payeng. He grew the forest, which became home to hundreds of species of animals, altered microclimates, and saved the island from erosion. When asked why he did it, he replied, "I simply planted trees so that animals would have a home. If we do not take care of nature, who will?" Jadav Payeng, the forest man of India, proved that one person with a bucket of water and a dream can accomplish more than entire governments with their multi-million-dollar programs. Jadav created an ecosystem, but the heroine of our next story survived by becoming part of another ecosystem. She was a little girl who got lost in the forest and was adopted by a troop of monkeys. Story number 24. The Girl Raised by Monkeys. Colombia. Somewhere in the jungle around 1954, a 4-year-old girl plays near her home. Suddenly, she is grabbed by strangers. A kidnapping. But something goes wrong. Perhaps the kidnappers were frightened by a chase. They throw the child deep into the impenetrable tropical forest and disappear. Alone, the girl doesn't know how to survive. She cries, calls for her mother, but only the cries of birds and the roars of monkeys reply. Days pass, and hunger becomes unbearable. The girl sees a troop of capuchin monkeys eating bananas that have fallen from the trees. She tries to approach them, but the monkeys hiss and drive her away. So she simply mimics them. She picks the same fruits and roots they do. Thus begins her new life. She spent 5 years in the jungle. Gradually, the troop accepted her. She learned to climb trees, though not as skillfully as the monkeys. She slept in hollows. She learned to understand their sounds, a cry of danger, a call for food. The monkeys cared for her, grooming the insects from her hair just as they did with their young. One day, she ate a poisonous fruit. A terrible pain twisted her stomach. She lay on the ground, dying. An old monkey, whom she named Grandfather, approached her, grabbed her by the scruff, and dragged her to a stream. He dipped her in the water, again and again, forcing her to expel the poison. The monkey saved her life. She forgot human speech. She walked on all fours. Her hands and feet became calloused. She became a part of the monkey tribe. Her odyssey ended as abruptly as it began. Hunters found her, but they did not save her. They sold her into a brothel in the city of Cucuta. There, the girl and the wild child were kept in a cage, like animals. She managed to escape. She lived on the streets, stealing, until a kind family took her in. They gave her the name Marina. They taught her to speak again and to walk upright. Later, she moved to England, got married, and had children. For many years, she remained silent about her past, fearing that she would be deemed insane. But one day, she revealed everything to her daughters. They convinced her to write a book. Scientists who studied her case confirmed her knowledge of Capuchin behaviors, her physiology, her memories. Everything points to the fact that this is an incredible story. Indeed, Marina Chapman is one of the few documented children of Mowgli who managed to completely reintegrate into human society. Marina survived by becoming part of a pack. But the hero of our next story survived because he refused to be part of the herd. He was a prisoner of war who escaped from a Soviet gulag in Siberia and walked 6,500 kilometers to India. This is story number 25, the man who walked home across half the world. Siberia, Gulag, 1941. A Polish officer named Włodzimierz Rawicz, arrested by the NKVD, sits in an icy barrack. Outside, it's minus 40 degrees and an endless taiga. He is 25 years old and sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. For most, this is a death sentence. But Rawicz and 6 other prisoners, a few Poles, a Lithuanian, and 1 American, decide to do the impossible. They plan an escape. One night during a snowstorm, they cut a hole in the wire and slip away into the taiga. They have no maps. They have no food except for a few pieces of bread. They have no weapons except for a homemade knife. Their goal is India, 6,500 kilometers to the south. They travel at night, hiding from patrols. They eat berries, mushrooms, and catch snakes. They cross frozen Lake Baikal, 100 kilometers on fragile ice under the icy wind that knocks them off their feet. They reach Mongolia, but instead of salvation, they find a new desert, the Gobi. This is the most terrifying part of their journey. During the day, the scorching sun. At night, freezing cold. There is no water. They suffer from thirst and hallucinations. 2 from the group die. The survivors push on. They cross Tibet, the Himalayas. They scale snow-covered passes at an altitude of 5,000 meters in summer clothing, suffering from altitude sickness. In March 1942, 11 months after their escape, 4 tattered, emaciated skeletons that resemble ghosts descend from the mountains and encounter a Gurkha patrol in India, which was then a British colony. Włodzimierz Rawicz and 3 of his companions survived. Their story, described in the book The Long Walk, became a symbol of inhuman will for freedom. Although later there was debate about whether all the details in Ravich's book were truthful, or if he recounted the stories of other escapees, the fact remains, this crossing was made. People traveled through the 3 harshest natural zones on the planet, led by nothing but hope. Rawicz and his friends were heading south, but the heroine of our next story went north, to the heart of Alaska, to build a home in the wilderness and live there for 30 years in complete solitude, becoming a legend of the American frontier. This is story number 26, The Woman Who Became the Queen of the Wild. Alaska, 1968. Richard Prenicky, a 52-year-old retired mechanic, decides to fulfill a lifelong dream. He finds a remote lake in the mountains that he names Twin Lakes and builds a log cabin there, alone, using only hand tools. He lived there for 30 years. His life was an ode to simplicity and self-sufficiency. He hunted, fished, and grew vegetables during the brief Alaskan summer. He kept detailed journals and filmed his life on 16mm film. These recordings would later become the famous film Into the Wild. Richard Prenneke was not a misanthropic hermit. He loved nature as a living entity. He observed grizzly bears, wolverines, and wolves not as prey, but as neighbors. He knew every bird and every tree. His cabin, built with incredible precision and craftsmanship, still stands as a monument to human genius. He proved that one can live in harmony with nature, not destroying it, but becoming part of it. However, Richard Prenneke's story would not be complete without mentioning another legend, about Ada Blackjack, a woman whose tale is reminiscent of a fairy tale. Her name was Ada Blackjack, 1921. A young Eskimo seamstress, she desperately needed money to treat her sick son. She agreed to go on an Arctic expedition to the uninhabited Wrangel Island as a cook and seamstress. The expedition, consisting of 5 people, was meant to claim the island for the British Empire, but something went wrong. The ship that was supposed to rescue them after a year could not break through the ice. Food began to run low. One of the members fell ill with scurvy. The 3 strongest men set out on foot across the ice for help, 700 miles to the mainland. They were never seen again. 2 remained on the island, Ada and the sick, temperamental scientist Lauren Knight. Ada, who had never hunted in her life and was afraid of guns, had to take care of him. She learned how to set traps for Arctic foxes, shoot seals, and fend off polar bears from their camp. Knight died, leaving Ada alone. For 2 years she survived on the icy island. Her only companion was the expedition's cat named Vic. She built boats from animal skins, repaired firearms, and kept a journal. She, a small fragile woman whom the male explorers considered useless, turned out to be the strongest of them all. In 1923, she was rescued by a ship and the Arctic Robinson returned to civilization. Yet, she was not interested in fame. She took the money she earned and treated her son. These 2, Prenneke and Blackjack, each in their own way, demonstrated that Alaska is not just a cold wilderness, but a place where the true essence of humanity is revealed. They survived in the wild, but the hero of our next story survived in a world where nature was replaced by numbers. He was a hacker who broke into the Pentagon using a computer the size of a wardrobe and nearly started the Third World War. And now, traces of UFOs. Story number 27. The hacker who searched for aliens in the Pentagon's computers. London, the early 2000s. Gary McKinnon, an unemployed system administrator, sits in his small bedroom, illuminated only by the blue light of his monitor. He is not searching for bank accounts or state secrets. He is searching for the truth. Gary is a ufologist. He firmly believes that the U.S. government is hiding technology obtained from aliens. He read accounts from eyewitnesses who claim to have seen photographs of extraterrestrial ships and lists of alien officers at NASA and the Pentagon. Using an old computer with a modem running at 56 kilobits per second, a speed at which downloading a single song took 30 minutes, Gary began his crusade. He wrote a simple program in Perl that scanned thousands of computers across American Army, Navy, and NASA networks, searching for machines without passwords, and he found hundreds. For 2 years, from February 2001 to March 2002, Gary McKinnon had virtually unlimited access to the most secret networks in the world. He wandered through the virtual corridors of the Pentagon, the U.S. Space Command, and the Navy Laboratory. He wasn't doing this to cause harm. He was like a child in a candy store. He left messages on military computer screens like, "Your security is rubbish." One day, he stumbled upon a folder titled Alien Officers. He started downloading a file, but his slow connection dropped halfway through. Another time, he accessed a computer at the Johnson Space Center in Houston and saw a high-resolution image on the screen. It was a silvery, saucer-shaped object hovering over the northern hemisphere. He was sure it was an alien ship. But at that moment, a NASA engineer noticed the cursor moving on his screen and cut off the connection. Yet his activities were not harmless. After the attacks on September 11, 2001, American authorities were in a state of paranoia. When they discovered the intrusion, they determined it had to be a cyber-terrorism incident. Gary's actions brought down a network of 2,000 computers in the Washington Military District, responsible for protecting the Capitol for 24 hours. The damage was estimated at $700,000. In 2002, he was arrested. The U.S. sought his extradition, charging him with the largest military computer hack of all time. He faced 70 years in prison. For 10 years, he fought against extradition. His lawyers argued that he was not a terrorist, just a curious eccentric with Asperger's syndrome. Ultimately, the British government denied the U.S. request for extradition. Gary McKinnon never found definitive proof of extraterrestrial existence, but he demonstrated that sometimes the most secure systems in the world can be hacked by a stubborn person in pajamas. Gary searched for ships in the sky, but the hero of our next story found a ship on the ground in the desert. He was an archaeologist who discovered the ancient solar bark of Pharaoh Khufu and paid for that discovery with a curse that haunted him throughout his life. Story number 28. The Curse of the Solar Bark and the Archaeologist Who Feared to Sleep. Egypt, Giza Plateau, 1954. The hot sun melts stone at the base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. A young Egyptian archaeologist, Kamal El-Malla, leads a routine effort to clear debris from the southern wall of the pyramid. Suddenly, a worker stumbles upon a gigantic limestone slab. Underneath it lie 41 more. This is the roof of a hermetically sealed underground chamber. Kamal realizes he is on the brink of a groundbreaking discovery. He drills a small hole in one of the slabs, lowers a mirror inside to catch a beam of sunlight, and looks inside. The scent of cedar and incense, locked away for 4,500 years, strikes him in the face. Below, in perfect condition, lies a giant wooden ship, disassembled into parts. This was the solar barge of Pharaoh Khufu, a burial vessel meant to carry the king's soul across the celestial Nile to the afterlife. This discovery was as significant as the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. Kamal El-Malla suddenly became a hero. Newspapers around the world wrote about him. But that very night, when he looked into the tomb, his life turned into a nightmare. He had a dream. He saw Pharaoh Khufu standing on the deck of his ship, pointing a finger at him. "You have disturbed my peace," the ghost said. "You will pay for this." From that day on, Kamal stopped sleeping. Every night he was plagued by nightmares. Sometimes he was drowning in the Nile, at other times he was buried under sand in the desert, or mummies chased him through the corridors of the pyramid. He lost weight and became irritable. He began to fear the dark. His friends, scholars, laughed at him. "Kamal, you're an educated man. What a curse!" "It's just the stress of fame." But strange things continued to happen. The chief restorer working on assembling the barge died of a heart attack right at his workstation. The photographer who took the first pictures died in a car accident. Kamal became obsessed with the idea that the spirit of the pharaoh was seeking revenge on him. He moved from his apartment to a small house right by the pyramid to be closer to the pharaoh and seek forgiveness. He secured 5 locks on his bedroom door, even though he lived alone. He spent 31 years in the shadow of his great discovery. In 1985, Kamal El-Malla, already elderly and tormented by insomnia, took his own life. In his suicide note, he wrote, "I can no longer go on. The pharaoh calls me. I am going to him." Whether this was a true curse or simply a figment of a man broken under the weight of responsibility, we may never know. But the story of the cursed barge has become a warning to all who dare disturb the sleep of eternity. Kamal El-Malla found his ship underground, but the heroes of our next story built their ship on the ground to fly into the sky, and their flight became the most incredible and touching adventure in the history of aviation. Story number 29. The paper bag that opened the sky to humanity. France, the town of Annonay, in the year 1782. Joseph Michel Montgolfier, the owner of a paper mill, sits by the fireplace. He thoughtfully watches as smoke and hot air carry ashes up the chimney. In his head, that of a dreamer and inventor, an idea is born with such power that it will change the world. What if I capture that smoke in a paper bag, he wonders. Will the bag rise like ash? He makes a small silk bag, holds it over the fire, and it soars to the ceiling. Joseph and his brother Jacques Etienne begin their great experiment. They are not physicists. They mistakenly believe that the lifting force is created not by hot air, but by a special gas of Montgolfier, which is contained in the smoke. Therefore, they burn not just firewood, but wet straw and old woolen rags to make the smoke thicker and smellier. On June 4th, 1783, they hold the first public demonstration. In the town square, they inflate a giant balloon made of burlap covered in paper. It rises to a height of 2,000 meters and travels 2 kilometers. The crowd is horrified and thrilled. People think it's witchcraft. The news reaches Paris and King Louis XV. The brothers are invited to Versailles. On September 19, 1783, the court of the Palace of Versailles gathers. All the French nobility is present, along with Queen Marie Antoinette. The Montgolfier brothers present their new balloon, luxurious, blue with golden patterns. But a question arises. Can a living creature withstand flight in the bad air at such height? The king suggests sending 2 criminals sentenced to death on the flight. If they survive, they will be pardoned. The brothers protest. The first flight should be an honor, not a punishment. They suggest sending animals instead. The first aeronauts in human history become a ram, a duck, and a rooster. They are placed in a woven basket suspended from the balloon. To the sound of cannon fire, the balloon rises into the sky. It flies for 8 minutes and gently lands in a forest 3 kilometers from Versailles. The animals are alive and well. The rooster, however, has injured its wing, but it turns out that it was simply pecked by the ram in the cramped basket. The way to the sky is opened. On November 21st of the same year, 2 brave souls, scientists Pilatre de Rosier and Marquis d'Arlincourt, make the first free flight of a human in a hot air balloon in history. They rise above the rooftops of Paris, waving to astonished townspeople, extinguishing the canopy with buckets of water that is heated up from sparks, and successfully landing. In just 6 months, the 2 brothers, inspired by smoke from the chimney, opened a brand new era for humanity, the era of ballooning. The Montgolfier brothers opened the path to the sky, but the hero of our last story opened the path to space, although his name is almost forgotten. He was a self-taught genius, a deaf school teacher who derived the formula for rocket flight in his little house in Kaluga 50 years before Gagarin. Story number 30. The deaf dreamer who heard the music of space. Russia, the city of Kaluga, the end of the 19th century. Konstantin Eduardovich Tsiolkovsky, a humble teacher of arithmetic and geometry, lives in a small wooden house on the outskirts of town. In his childhood, after scarlet fever, he became almost completely deaf. The world of sounds closed to him forever. But it is in this silence that he began to hear what no one else could. He heard the whispers of the stars. Tsiolkovsky was self-taught. He was expelled from school, and he gained all his knowledge from books in the library. He crafted hearing tubes, built models of airships, but his main passion was space. At a time when flight in an airplane was still a fantasy, this deaf provincial teacher dreamed of flights to the moon and Mars. His ideas seem pure madness to his contemporaries. He writes scientific papers about weightlessness, about multi-stage rockets, about spacesuits. He draws blueprints of orbital stations resembling giant rotating wheels where centrifugal force creates artificial gravity. The scientific community ignores him. His articles are not published. People laugh at him, calling him the Kaluga oddball. He lives in poverty, spending a meager salary on chemical reagents for experiments. But he does not give up. In 1903, his major work, a study of the worlds of space with reactive devices, published in an obscure magazine called Scientific Review. Within this article, among complex calculations, there was one formula. Today, it is known to every rocket engineer as the Tsiolkovsky formula. It mathematically proved that the only way to overcome Earth's gravity is with a liquid-fueled rocket. He calculated the speed required to achieve orbit and demonstrated that it was possible. This formula is the cornerstone of all astronautics. Tsiolkovsky did not build a single rocket. He was a theorist, a prophet. He wrote, "Earth is the cradle of the mind, but one cannot live forever in a cradle." He died in 1935, never witnessing his ideas come to life. Yet his work did not disappear. It was closely studied by a young engineer named Sergei Korolev, who would later build the rocket that placed the first satellite and the first human into orbit. Wernher von Braun, the creator of the American lunar program, considered Tsiolkovsky his teacher. When Yuri Gagarin flew into space, he was essentially following the trajectory calculated by the silent teacher from Kaluga 50 years earlier in the quiet of his cottage. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a man who did not hear the voices of people, heard the call of the universe and charted a road to the stars for humanity. And once again, we close the final folder. 30 stories, 30 incredible fates. We saw a man sell a tower he did not own, and an army lose a war to birds. We witnessed how people survived on the ocean floor and in the skies, how they built castles from trash and entire forests from a single seed. These chronicles are not just a collection of curiosities, they are proof that within each of us lives a spark of madness, genius, stubbornness, and love for life, capable of changing the world. Reality is far richer and stranger than any fiction. One just needs to know how to listen to its quiet voice. Our archive once again descends into silence, but the stories within it do not sleep. They wait for their moment to be told once more. Thank you for spending this time with me. Seek your own incredible stories, for they are everywhere. M.